Hi, everyone. Welcome to my talk. This talk is on the long lifespans in the Bible. So, at this point in kind of my science and religion series that we're going through, we're kind of switching gears a little bit, and now we're focused more on the Bible and what are kind of different things that either occur or are mentioned in the Bible that may have scientific kind of implications, or how do we understand them from a scientific perspective. So before we were going from science and what does that mean in regards to religion, and now we're kind of going to the other side of the coin in a way. So, in that regard, in the Bible, there are some rather long lifespans that are mentioned. So, how do we kind of deal with that when right now most people are not living for as long of a time? So, how can we kind of reconcile that and understand that if we can at all? So, let's look at what the biblical text says. So, pre Noah, the lifespans at that time range from about 900 to 600 years. So, for example, Jared was mentioned to have 962 years in Genesis 5:20. And the oldest person that is mentioned in the Bible is Methuselah at 969 years in Genesis 5:27. So these are kind of the oldest in the Bible, 962, 969. So just to kind of give you an idea of like what's the top. And then from Adam down into Noah, the ages range from like 969 being on the top all the way down to about 600. And most people, the average age were about, it was closer to 600. So those were the norm. But it's the question is this possible? And is the biblical calendar accurate when it says that they had 969 years? Is it the kind of the same as what we're thinking about now? And is this accurate? Or is it not really 960 years, but do these represent maybe a series of generations instead of a specific individual's lifetime? So is it not just Methuselah, but maybe Methuselah's family or, a group of people? So let's look at this. So first, what we want to do is we want to kind of say, okay, are these numbers representing individuals or generations? How can we understand these numbers? 600, 969, etc. So within the total time span of the biblical calendar, which is about 57 centuries since Adam, give or take a little bit of years, but around 57 centuries, there are no conflicts between the chronology and the scientifically established dates. So, what that means is the things that are mentioned or described in the Bible match the scientific dating of when those things happened based on archaeological finds. So, one example of kind of this correlation is the dating of the early Bronze Age. So I use this example because this is the earliest post-Adam event that's found in the Bible that might appear in archaeological finds, and that's the invention of forged brass tools. So I want to kind of give you the oldest possible example. So this is kind of the first one where something is happening in the Bible that we should find some sort of archaeological or some sort of evidence, physical evidence that we could kind of date using that evidence to match what it says in the Bible. Okay? So in Genesis 4:22, it says that Zillah also had a son named Tubal-Cain. And Tubal-Cain forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. And the early Bible was written in Hebrew. And in the early Hebrew, the word for brass and bronze was denoted by actually the same word, Nehoseth. And so this is the word that was used to represent kind of the tools that Tubal-Cain forged. So Tubal-Cain is attributed to the development of forging, and he's also the son of Lamech, which will be important later when we look through the genealogies. So to place a biblical date for the early Bronze Age, so we can look at it from a scientific perspective, but if we want to look at it from the Bible, then we need to calculate the time passed from Tubal-Cain's birth until the present. So it doesn't say exactly when did Tubal-Cain invent forging, but if we go from the time he was born until present age, that'll give us a rough estimate, give or take just a few years, as to when was the beginning of the early Bronze Age. Now, the genealogical line that leads to the present is the line that survived the flood in Noah and his children. So the line that kind of continues on now are those that were in the ark. And this line came from Adam through Seth. So Adam and Eve had Cain and Abel, and then after Cain murdered Abel, then they had their third son, which was Seth. And so the age of each generation of Seth's descendants is actually listed in the Bible. So you can look at each one of these descendants and kind of do the math and calculate it all the way to present. However, we're not kind of trying to follow Seth. We're actually trying to want the time from Tubal-Cain to present. But Tubal-Cain, even though was an ancestor of Adam and Eve, it was a descendant of Cain and not Seth. So Adam and Eve had Abel, Cain, and Seth. We have the line of all the way of Seth, but Cain was the kind of the ancestor for Tubal-Cain. So Tubal-Cain was a descendant of Cain, not Seth. So, but the Bible does not list the individual ages of Cain's descendants. And this is most likely due to the line of Cain being destroyed in the flood in Genesis 7. So, to learn the dates of Cain's generations, we need to compare their generations with the parallel generations of Seth. Since we know the dates and ages for Seth, we can compare it with Cain. So, here is just a table that is a comparison. So, on the left side is the genealogical line of Seth, and on the right side is the genealogical line of Cain. And so what this is it's the first line is Adam, and then it lists the age of the son that is then listed. So when Adam was 130 years, he then had Seth. And this is listed in Genesis 5:3. So when Adam was 130, he had Seth. When Seth was 105, he had Enosh. When Enosh was 90, he had Kenan, etc. All the way down to Lamech, and then Noah. And it just says that Noah was 600 years at the flood. And we're using the flood as kind of that stopper point. And so if you add all these up from Adam all the way to the time of the flood was 1,656 years. Now we know that Adam had Cain, and then from the Bible, we know this order. We don't know the dates like we do with Seth, but we know who was the father of whom. So Adam to Cain, Cain to Enoch, all the way down to Lamech, and then Lamech had Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain. And so now we can kind of get the ordering there. So in the comparison table, there are two fixed biblical reference points: the age of Cain at the birth of Seth, and the age of Noah at the flood that destroyed Cain's progeny. So we know that the flood was at when Noah was 600. So from the comparison table, Tubal-Cain was the last in the line of Cain to be born prior to the flood. So in the whole order after Tubal-Cain, then we had the flood. So that puts his life sometime in the lifetime of Noah. So if we want to say, well, when did Tubal-Cain invent forging? If the flood was when Noah was 600, well, it wouldn't have been when he was 600. It would have been, a little bit before that. So if we want to say we could just pick the midpoint of that age, so it was 600 years before the flood from Noah's lifetime, and that Tubal-Cain did that at some time in the lifetime of Noah. So we can just say 300. So if we want to say that it was at 300, then we would place the early Bronze Age 300 years before. So if we look at the table, this whole time took 1,656 years. But if we want to say that it was at 300 years, so in this halfway point, then that would be 1,356 years. So we can place from the biblical definition, we can place the early Bronze Age at about 1,350 years after the appearance of Adam. So that's how many years passed from the time of Adam until when forging and the early Bronze Age would start. But we're actually not wanting to know from Adam till when it started, but we actually want to know when did it start in relation to the present age. So in the year 1990, all the generations since Adam have a cumulative age of 5,750 years. So the way they get this is just the same way we just did, is with Adam, and then it has all the generations listed with how old they were when their son was born, and you can do the math. Then it also has the age of when they passed. So you can kind of do the cumulative math of the generations. So from Adam all the way until present, which is 5,750 years. So to get the biblical date of the early Bronze Age, we have this big chunk. So from Adam to present. And we know that the early Bronze Age was about here. So we want this time from the Bronze Age to present, but we actually know this time. So if we want this time, all we have to do is subtract this time from the total time, and that's what we would get. So to get the biblical date of the early Bronze Age, we need to subtract the time from Adam to Tubal-Cain, which we said was about 1300, 1,350 years, from the total amount of time from Adam to present, which is about 5,750. So that would give us the biblical date of the early Bronze Age to be approximately 4,400 years ago from present. Now, that's what the Bible says based on genealogies and dates provided there. So now let's look at what is the accepted archaeological date. So the first appearance of the early brass tools was approximately 2,400 BC, or if we want to talk about it from present, that would be 4,400 years ago. So we can see here that the scientific date for the early kind of Bronze Age was 4,400 years ago, and the biblical record is also 4,400 years ago. So here, the early Bronze Age coincides with Tubal-Cain's lifetime, who is known from the Bible to be the biblical inventor of bronze tools. So this kind of gives us more conclusions that the ages that are listed in that Bible time, in the pre-Noah time, is actual ages of individuals and not of generations, but numbers that we can actually use and count on in the same way that we kind of count years and nowadays, since they match up with the biblical and scientific record. So then if that's the case, then how do we, from a scientific perspective, rationalize or explain why there were 969 to about 600 years prior to the flood? And then why do we now have such lower numbers? So now that we know we can accept those dates and those numbers, how do we kind of manage that? So let's think about, what do we know about aging? So aging is a metabolic process. Each species is programmed for death at a given age range. So fleas live to 5 years, dogs to about 15, and humans about 70. So we don't see fleas reaching the age of 70 because it's based on their genetic packaging. Based on their genetics, it only has them kind of programmed to live for about 5 years. So it doesn't allow them to live further. So our aging is all based on how we are kind of genetically wired. But there can be changes in this aging. So there are mutations in our genes that can actually upset this delicate aging process. One of them is called progeria, and progeria speeds up the aging process by almost tenfold. So you actually are aging 10 times faster than you would. So every 1 year is about 10 years. So what happens is this causes a teenager to die with the body of an old person. So here's a picture of one example. So this person may only live for, on the earth time, 11 years, but because of the aging process being sped up, their body has actually aged 10 times longer than just those 11 years. And so most of them as teenagers will pass away because their body is imagining them as an older person. But that's the opposite. That's one direction. But what about the reverse? Can we actually slow aging by tenfold? So this is speeding up and having people die much quicker. But can we actually have people die much longer, live a lot longer, and die after a lot longer period? So if the human metabolism was slower, then lifespans would be longer during that pre-Noah period. But would we actually be able to see evidence of this? So we actually wouldn't see any evidence of this in the fossil record. So if the human metabolism was slower, we would find the fossils, but the fossils would just appear to have formed from younger individuals. This is the same with other cases of the reverse. You would just assume that it was an older individual, and you wouldn't actually know that they died at a younger age if it was the opposite, with it being the age being sped up. So if the age was slowed down, we would just think that they were much younger than they actually were. So fossils don't really give us evidence, scientific evidence here of if this were the case or not the case. So I just want to kind of give a little bit of comparison of these ages, both numerically and in this graph here. So pre-Noah times, ages at the birth of a firstborn. So when did people usually have their first child? So this is kind of similar. If you go back to the table that we showed earlier, the ages were about between 100 and 130 was about the average for when they would have the firstborn child. And ages at death range between 600 to 900. So that's kind of the range there. So you can kind of see that here. Here is the chart here. So between 600 and 900 is kind of those pre-Noah lifespans. Now, modern time, currently, we want to say, okay, well, what's the age usually at the firstborn? Well, puberty is usually reached between 11 to 13. Now, we don't usually have children between 11 and 13, but that's due to cultural reasons and not because of biological reasons, which in pre-Noah times, there wouldn't have been a reason to kind of delay that. So we want to use the 11 to 13 kind of as the comparison. And currently, death is about between 60 to 90 years old. So if we actually look at the pre-Noah times for the ages of the firstborn and death compared to modern times, we'll actually see there's about a tenfold difference. So the pre-Noah ages for both puberty and death are about 10 times, a tenfold higher. So it's as if the entire process was slowed by a factor of 10. And this could have been caused by a metabolic shift. So now let's kind of look at what of those options. So why would these lifespans change? So according to population genetics, the environment selects from the variety of metabolic processes that provide the most advantageous aspect of the trait. So what metabolic processes would allow for a certain trait to continue into the gene pool and for life to continue? So there are several suggestions regarding the changes in lifespan. So several things that people are suggesting caused this change in the lifespans. So the first option is climate change. Second is genetic bottlenecking. Third is diet change. Fourth is increased oxygen. And the fifth is the consequence of sin. Now, one thing I do want to mention is that it's not really thought that one of these individually had, but a kind of a combination of these was the effect. Now, some may have stronger evidence versus the other ones. And we're going to go through each of these individually. So then you can kind of make your conclusion of which of these suggestions do you feel has stronger evidence than the other? And if we were to take all these possibilities, all these factors together, because remember, the environment is affected by lots of different factors. So it wouldn't be just one thing that would be affecting the environment and affecting those that are living at that time. It would be multiple kind of environmental changes or factors. So the first one that is mentioned is climate change. So Nahmanides, who was an ancient Jewish rabbi and scholar and wrote several commentaries on the Torah, he suggested that the shortening of the lifespans after Noah's time and following the population dispersion after the destruction of the Tower of Babel resulted from a more demanding climate. And so he's suggesting that the reason that these lifespans were shortened was because of the climate. So prior to the flood, We had a tropical environment favoring long life, so a much more tropical kind of environment. And then post-flood, the Earth's atmosphere and climate changed drastically. It changed a lot. We ended up having an ice age that covered nearly 30% of the Earth with ice, causing a gradual shortening of individual lifespans. Because of this effect of the environment, people were not able to live as long. So this is one suggestion for the change or decrease in the lifespans. The second is the genetic bottlenecking. So genetic bottlenecking is when there's a significant loss of access to other people's versions of genes called alleles, meaning they're essentially lost. So what bottlenecking means is if this is the general population, this first bottle here. So you see there's more variety. You have kind of almost looking at this half white and half blue. Kind of the blue and the white are kind of almost equal. And then you have just a very small portion of yellow. So we have three different kind of varieties in the original population. But then you have a bottlenecking event. And so what the bottlenecking means is that you may have a larger population, but now this population is decreased. Something happens to decrease the population that survives. So now you have this bottlenecking event. So not everybody's going to come through and they survive. And in this case, you can see that the yellow examples here, kind of the yellow alleles, are completely lost. So that is going to be kind of one version of genes that we won't have in the population anymore. And then you'll also see here that the ratio of blue to white before it was about half and half, like they were about equal. Here you can see it's much more dominated by the blue instead of the white. So now the genetic makeup of the population is very different from the original population. So this is genetic bottlenecking. And there are two major genetic bottlenecks in the Bible. And I want to actually go back to that picture that I showed here. So in this chart, you can see kind of the lifespan is pretty plateaued up until Noah. So then we have the flood, and then it drastically decreases, and then it plateaus again. And it plateaus right about the time of the Tower of Babel, where it then decreases again, and then you kind of get a plateau as well after that. So you see that there's kind of two decreases, which match up with the two major events of this genetic bottlenecking at the time of the flood and after the Tower of Babel. And just to remind you, at the Tower of Babel, this is when there was the confusion of languages and people were dispersed. So let's go into each of these a little bit more. So at the flood, this reduced the alleles in the gene pool in humanity to only 8 people. So on the ark, there was only 8 people. So remember, it was Noah and his wife, and they had 3 sons and their wives. So 8 people in total. But actually, if we're talking about how many people in regards to the population increasing, it's really only 6 people because in Genesis 10, scripture says that Noah and his wife had no more sons after the flood. So really, there's only 6 people that are left kind of within that gene pool of going to be repopulating and passing it on. So this leaves Shem, Ham, and Japheth. But even though they're there, they have similar genes because they all have the same 2 parents and their wives. So in a way, you kind of only have like 4 differences because Shem, Ham, and Japheth are going to be very similar. Obviously, they're not equivalent and equal, but they're going to have much more similar genes than their 3 wives. So ages after the flood, like I said before, do a sudden drop and are stabilized about 450 years. So pre-flood, we have 900 to 600, with 600 being the more norm for the ages, 900 being, kind of the extremes. And then after we have that decrease, like I showed in the graph, they kind of stable at 450. So then they stable out at about 450 years until we get to the Tower of Babel. And so after the dispersion of the Tower of Babel, so this is when language was confused and people scattered out throughout the world. Then we have another bottlenecking because you had a large population and now you have a bunch of smaller populations. So each of these different smaller populations that are kind of now together are going to have less variation in their gene pool. So here, the ages suddenly drop from about 450 years to about 235 years or so. So for the next three generations. So remember on that chart, I said it kind of drops and then it starts to plateau out. And we see that where it mentions that Terra lived to only about 205 years. And then after that point, if you were to continue, you would see that the age limits start to kind of trickle down steadily from there until it plateaus to about what we have nowadays. So then you kind of see just like a steady decline. So that's one explanation. So climate change. Then we have genetic bottlenecking. The third is diet change. So another ancient Jewish rabbi and scholar who also wrote commentaries is Maimonides, and he postulated that the difference in the lifespans was due to a change in diet. So people were first permitted to eat meat after the flood. So Genesis 9:3, after the flood, now people are permitted to eat meat. And before, they were mainly had a vegetarian diet. So some scholars thought that this original vegetarian diet, as mentioned in Genesis 1:29, would have helped people to live such great ages. But scientifically, there's little evidence that vegetarians actually attain a lifespan much different than those who retain meat in their diet. So this may have been a greater impact at that time than it is now. So remember, we're talking about five different kind of factors here. So this could have had a higher weighting in the time right after the flood, because when you introduce a brand new thing into your diet, it will have a greater impact. Right nowadays, because we've kind of had meat for such a long time in our diet, that our bodies and genes would have adjusted to it. And so this is kind of one reason why you might not see as big of an impact between meat eaters and vegetarians now compared to at that time, because it would have been more of a shock to their system and affected them. Plus, you have the effect of climate, genetic bottlenecking, and the other factors as well that would kind of play into the diet change as well. The fourth factor is increased oxygen. So, prior to the flood, in that more tropical environment, there were increased oxygen levels, which these oxygen levels were actually dramatically changed after the flood. Remember, I said it was more of a kind of ice age and drier, colder climate than that tropical pre-flood climate. And so increased oxygen levels have both a positive and a negative benefit. So increased oxygen allows our body to heal and eliminate disease. But if it's too high or too high for a long time, then it can also be detrimental to the health. So oxygen, we know, is extremely reactive, which causes oxidation in our body where we don't actually want it to occur. And in this case, it can cause birth defects such as blindness in children. So having the increased oxygen levels could have allowed for the bodies to heal, eliminate disease, allow them to live longer. But having too much oxygen could also have a reverse effect. So this, just to kind of give a preface or a caveat, if you're trying to live longer, that doesn't necessarily mean to just go and have like a bunch of oxygen to have higher oxygen levels. Remember, it's all in comparison to the other factors that are stated. And the last factor that I want to introduce is not necessarily a scientific one, but it is one that is very strongly mentioned in the biblical account. So in the Bible, it talks about the consequence of sin. So before the fall, Adam and Eve, when God created them, they were created and designed to live in the Garden of Eden with God forever. So they were not created with the intent that they would die and be separated from God. However, when Adam and Eve sinned, this caused the earth to now be cursed and for death to enter into mankind. So now man and mankind will die, And also, at this point now, the earth is going to be cursed. And so, this theory says that this curse of death kind of slowly weighs heavily on the environment and mankind, slowly killing everything, such decreasing the lifespans. So, as life continues, the idea here would be that lifespans would just slowly decrease. If we took out the other factors, genetic bottlenecking and oxygen and diet and the climate change, then it would say that just over time, we would have a steady decrease in the lifespans just due to the effect of sin in our bodies and in the environment around us. And this could be one of the explanations also for maybe that dramatic climate change as well, besides the flood, other climate events that we have affecting us living on Earth due to the effect of sin being on the environment as well. And this is also another explanation for different mutations and other kind of breakdowns in the genetic code is based on the theory that the consequence of sin is causing that as well. So we have talked about 5 different factors that could be suggested as reasons or things that contributed to having longer lifespans, or you could think about why did those long lifespans decrease at the flood and at the Tower of Babel. So remember we said climate change is one factor, genetic bottlenecking, diet change, increased oxygen, and consequence of sin. So I just ask you to think through those 5 factors and think about, is there any others that maybe I didn't include that you think might have been important factors? Or are any of these ones that you are like, not so sure if I agree? So thank you so much for my talk. And we will, on our next talk, look at dinosaurs and how do we deal with dinosaurs and the biblical record? Here are my references, just a few of them for this talk. You're welcome to look at these and to kind of compare or dive deeper into this topic.